This is Brittany Pierce, and thank you so much for joining us today for Ryan Swanson's 33rd Annual Employment Law Webinar. This COVID mandates, what to do in COVID. This is the #1 employment advising question we have gotten definitely in the past year. It is, probably the past 18 months. This has been a hot topic that everyone wants to know about, and we are filling you in today on the latest and greatest. Before we get too far, I just got to tell you, what we're telling you today is what's happening today. And that means it is very likely going to change tomorrow and very likely going to change in the future. You guys read the news, you see on the news constantly is latest updates on vaccine mandates, on lawsuits, on what the law is, what employers can do, what employee rights are. All of those things are happening just in real time. And so things are changing. And so we're going to be talking about what's happening now, but it's really important just to keep abreast of what's going on, keep updated on the news. I'm sure all of you guys are on top of that, of course, but worth reminding you that this is ever evolving. It's not static. So we're trying to give you the best info we can, but there is lots more to come. So a couple of the things we're going to be talking about today are vaccine mandates, of course, and when those are required, what the accommodations are. That's a big one. Ooh, we hear a lot about accommodation requests. Also, return to work. So I think a lot of people were looking at October 1. That date seems to be pretty far out the window nowadays. So we'll talk about when that's happening and what to do for that. And of course, so many workforces are still remote and how to handle that remote work and what laws are still applying. And especially if you're going to continue with remote work in the future, what to expect for that. Hiring and termination during COVID. Yes, you can hire. Yes, you should hire. Yes, you can terminate. Some, caveats in there, but we'll go through that. And the dreaded one, litigation, what litigation looks like and what you can expect. So we'll touch base on that as well. So we've got, coming up here, vaccine to mandate or to not mandate. And that is the question. Now, sometimes you are going to be required to mandate. And we're going to go through a few of those. But in other cases, it's optional. And a lot of folks for whom it's optional, a lot of companies are grappling with whether or not to mandate. So we'll talk through some of that and give you some ideas on what that will look like. Now, for those folks that are required, of course, we've got our Washington state mandate. Oh, and I should say, a lot of this is geared today towards Washington state and Washington state employees. Washington is certainly on the side of encouraging, mandating mandates versus other states are sometimes barring mandates. And so this is more Washington specific. If you are in another state, please do keep a lookout for what those states' laws are. But this is, good rule of thumb for Washington to keep in mind, because I figure if you're here, you probably do care about what Washington has to say. So Washington state mandate, yes, we've got requirements for all of these employees you see on your screen. So of course, if you're a state employee, if you're a childcare employee, long-term healthcare providers, all of those people. We have a website down at the bottom right there. This is the governor's website, and it has a lot of good answers to your questions about this mandate. Really encourage you to go check this out if you fall into one of these categories. Big picture, of course, are the few bullet points we've got here, which is what's the deadline? October 18. That is a few weeks away for having fully vaccinated employees in these categories by that time. So hopefully we've got people who are already, on top of that. This shouldn't be new news for people in Washington that fit into this category, but this is when you are going to start probably having and finding out about those people that do not want to comply and what you'll need to do then. And we'll get to that in a minute. Of course, employers do need to be verifying vaccination status. And again, we'll talk about some of the requirements there, but this is not just an honor system necessarily, or this is not where the employer gets to stick head in sand. It's you really must be verifying, documenting that, and going through that process, which we'll touch base about. Of course, in this instance, and this will be different from some other options here, but there is the prong that unvaccinated employees will be terminated unless there is an accommodation required for medical or religious. So keep in mind, this is a mandatory, that's why they call it a mandate, and really does need to happen. So hopefully folks are well aware of this at this point in the game. All right, what about federal employees? So this is, we just talked about state, there are federal employees as well. There is a mandatory vaccine requirement for federal employees, and that date is different. That date is November 22. And again, this applies to, folks in the military, again, healthcare workers. We're going to talk about the large employers in just a sec, but also federal contractors. So need to make sure if you are in the federal contractor category, you are complying with this. So again, deadline is coming up. There is still time, but make sure you're aware of this and complying, of course, as well. This is the big one. This is the one we're getting lots and lots of questions about, and it's no wonder because this rule is, well, I guess it's not an official rule yet. It's just Biden has said this is going to be a rule someday soon, but it is for large employers. And this is the vaccine mandate for companies with 100 or more employees. So that affects over 80 million workers in our country. Obviously a smaller number in Washington, but it is a very big deal and it's going to affect so many people. And this is where we're getting a lot of questions about what's happening, what can we expect, what can we do to prepare? So we'll talk about those things. And I think the first one is when and what. Well, OSHA is going to issue a rule. Biden's plan on this came out earlier in the month. I want to say September 9 or around there, and said, hey, this rule could be coming out somewhere within the next few weeks or beyond. It's been almost 3 weeks. We have not seen the rule yet. We don't know when that is coming. I think people are anticipating it sooner rather than later, kind of depended on what was in the works before Biden made this announcement. We don't have it yet, but I would expect it anytime now. So this is one of those areas where we really do want you to be keeping your eye out on the news. Just like Biden's announcement on this, I'm sure it's going to be everywhere. It'll be hard to miss, but good to pay attention to and, keep your eye on what's happening so you know exactly what we'll be seeing in the rule. So again, this applies to companies with 100 or more employees. The rule, when it comes out, should be giving a lot more detailed information. So, for example, what does 100 or more employees look like? The word is that it's going to mean any company that has that number of employees, and it's not going to be just in one location. It should be spread out around locations, but the rule should cover details about that. So we'll find out more in that rule. The mandate is essentially employers with 100 or more employees need to require their employees to be mandated, but there's an alternative. The alternative is to allow weekly testing. And I'll get into that more in a second, but just to be clear, if for some reason you do not want to do a mandatory vaccine, there is that alternative. And I should also say, there's also a question about, and I saw this actually in the chat, hey, does this involve on-site or off-site workers for counting your 100 employees? Again, this will also be in the rule. Do we know the answer yet? No. We've had some indication that it could just require on-site workers as opposed to permanent remote workers, but we do not know yet. So this number, how to define this number is a little bit in flux as we wait on the rule. How to define who it applies to will change a little bit with the rule as well. For example, some mandates apply to any employees, doesn't matter if you're remote or not. I think our state and federal are under that. This one, we don't know for sure yet. So this is something we're going to have to keep aware of if it's on-site, off-site, remote or what. So keep that in mind, another prong. But in the back of your mind, if you have 100 or more employees as a company, you should be paying real close attention to this, even if a portion of your workforce is remote. Let's say you do want to do the alternative testing. There's going to be a lot required with respect to that, about how to handle the testing. We'll talk about who's paying for that, reporting. All of this is going to need to be kept track of. OSHA does require a lot of record keeping for employers, and where there are record keeping requirements, this might blow your mind if you don't know this. In some cases, employers have to keep records, certain records for 30 years. So we got to set this up right at the beginning. That's why we got to make sure we're paying attention to what this rule is and complying with that, because this could be around a long time. And we'll talk about there are penalties for not complying too. Of course, there are accommodations. So that means if you have a worker who cannot be vaccinated for a medical reason or a sincerely held religious belief, so the religious reason, how are we going to deal with that? And so we'll talk about those in a minute and what documentation is required. I see a couple of questions popping up about that, so I'll cover those and we'll follow up, of course, with follow-up questions on that. But it is, I would say this is one of the biggest, if not the biggest questions that employers are facing. And I should say not just people in this category of 100 or more employees, but in all different categories of any size employer, because for some of it, it's new and people may be trying to exploit it and trying to deal with that. So it is a big deal and sadly rife with litigation opportunity. So again, handling accommodations, we'll touch base on that, and then tracking the vaccination status, of course. And so you need to make sure if you're going with the requirement of vaccines as opposed to weekly testing, keeping track of all of that as well. Fully vaccinated means something different today than it might mean in the future. Today, if you get your one Johnson & Johnson, you're good. If you've got, 2 of the Moderna or Pfizer, but even just this week, things are changing with the boosters and they are going to continue to change. And so this is a place where you're going to have to be aware again and keep track of what's happening in the news there. Not on the slide, but what we anticipate is there is going to be a requirement for employers to give employees paid time off to become vaccinated and to recover from vaccine side effects. There's a little question about that. Again, we hope will be addressed in the rule, which is, do you have to give new additional paid time off, or can you just require that your employees use their existing PTO and their existing PTO bank? And there's been some indication that it could be the latter. So you don't have to give extra time other than what they already have accrued. And of course, in our state, we've got sick and safe leave time as well. And so this could fall into that, but we'll be on the lookout for the rule there, of course. As far as time frame, supposedly, up to 75 days to get vaccinated from when this rule comes out. We will see if that changes in the rule, but that's a loose time frame to be thinking about. I think in any case, when you are doing a mandate, whether you fit into this category or if you're just an employer that wants to do one, you do need to give time for your employees to be vaccinated. This is not something you can say, this starts Monday, or it starts tomorrow. We've got to give advance notice for people to get vaccinated. And of course, there's a time distance between first shot and second shot, so we need to allow that time as well. And so be on the lookout for that in the rule. What happens if you are not complying with this large employer rule that's going to be coming out? Fines are going to be happening, apparently up to $14,000 per violation. Again, we don't know the details about this, but this is something the Biden administration really wants everyone to take seriously. And of course, that's why they put penalties in place. What I've just talked about, kind of the mandatory for various, federal, state, and large employers. Again, that's not the only end all be all. If you don't fit into that category, you can still mandate vaccines for your workforce. And again, that can be requiring that the employees are vaccinated or allowing testing. And so what does this mean if you are allowing testing? That testing needs to be done weekly. So far, no decision yet on what types of tests are allowed. At this point, I think you've got some flexibility in what types of tests you want your employees to be able to take. The goal is to, of course, have a safe workplace. And so you want to perhaps be giving more options to employees to get tested, so that way they are not coming to work unknowingly contagious or with COVID. And so, we want to make sure people are getting tested, but there may be some requirements around this coming out. Again, If you are allowing testing, there is going to be a reporting process. You are going to have to require documentation about this at this point. Who's getting the documentation? Where do you keep all this? All of these things should be considered like medical and kept confidential. So what we don't want is your average manager finding out all of this information about your employees. And so really it's best to streamline this, keep it in HR if you have HR. Otherwise, keep it with a manager or a couple of managers that are appropriately trained about confidentiality and keeping records and keeping this confidential, and making sure it's not able to be accessed publicly. This is not something you want on your server for anyone to click into and be able to find out who's vaccinated, who's not, how did they test. You want this to be kept secure and confidential. Again, if you aren't able to produce documentation as a worker, then you are not meeting the requirement of the mandate. If you are not able to provide documentation as a company, if OSHA is investigating, then you are in violation and subject to fines. As far as who pays for the testing, this should be addressed in the rule. This is different by state. Washington currently does not have a requirement to pay for certain testing in most circumstances. There are exceptions to that. For example, if you are requiring, employees to go to a certain provider or take certain tests or things like that, there might be exceptions where an employer has to pay for that. Hopefully this will be covered by insurance. But again, for the large employer weekly testing piece, that should be addressed in the rule. And if you, again, are not in that large employer category and still want to be following something similar to what the large employer rule is going to be, I'd suggest, that's a good defense for you, is to say, hey, we're following what is required for large employers and trying to do the same types of things. We aren't trying to create different or additional burdens on employees. We're trying to follow that rule, even though we technically don't have that number of employees. So something to consider there. So this is, consequences for employees failing to comply with that mandate or with your own voluntary company mandate if you're a smaller sized employer. There are options to discipline if you want to, and that can be up to and including termination. The big question that we talk about a lot with companies is, well, do you want to terminate? Do you want to, what if it's your best employee, your best 10 employees that aren't complying for, and this is a non-protected reason, by the way. So this is not a medical or religious reason, but, just a moral reason, or just a political reason, or just they just don't want someone to tell them what to do reason. So in those circumstances, yes, you can terminate if you want to, but you should consider, do you want to? And you should also consider that you need to be making this decision and applying it across the board. So let's say you've got 5 employees that refuse to comply with your company mandate. 2 of whom are amazing workers and you don't want to terminate. 3, whatever, maybe you could let them go. Don't do something different for those sets of employees. You need to apply it across the board and be consistent. So you might not be there yet. This might be something you want to make a decision on the consequences for later. First of all, when we see the rule, of course. And second of all, when on your workforce who is not going to comply, and make some decisions then. So this is not something that needs to be decided today. It is something that needs to be decided eventually. So keep an eye out for that. All right, the accommodations. This, again, of course, is where we're getting a lot of questions, and I'll chat about, which is where there's a lot of litigation. Medical and religious accommodations are the 2 things we're going to be talking about here. So medical, I think the easiest way for people to really think about this is to think about this like you do your other accommodation process. And, some might be too small to have certain accommodation requirements, but in general, think of it like the Americans with Disabilities Act. How do you deal with that process? When someone says they have a medical condition or something requiring accommodation, you enter into the interactive process. You can require medical verification. And let me just say, you should be requiring medical verification in this circumstance, simply because I think there's going to be an increase of people that are going to be claiming medical needs. And I put that kind of in quotes because some people say it's a medical need that they believe that is not medically supported by their doctor. And those put different obligations on a company. If it's just the employee says, well, I medically need to stay home because I think it's better for my health. That is a very different thing than your doctor saying, this employee cannot be vaccinated or potentially undergo weekly testing for, certain medical reasons and having that medically supported. So when in doubt, requiring medical provider information is great. Oh, I should say this, we didn't touch on in this presentation, and you're going to hear about it when Hannah talks the HELSA, the Health Emergency Labor Standards Act, and high-risk workers a little bit. But just so you know, in Washington, even under that, for high-risk workers, you now can also request medical information. That didn't used to be the case. You can now. So keep that in mind as well. And again, keep an eye out on whether or not we're going to need to pay for testing. Again, not yet in Washington for the most part, but that could be changing. And also I should say for both of these, for medical and religious, this is really an individualized process. So this is, you've got to, talk to each employee, see what their medical needs are and address those as necessary. And same for religion. Religious accommodation is something that has been protected for a long time, but frankly hasn't been super common. It is getting more common now. And so you need to treat religious accommodations requests the same as you did previously. So if you were used to dealing with those, same process. If you weren't dealing with those before, you now need to be treating all religious accommodation requests the same. You cannot treat one religion differently than another. What the employee needs to have for this accommodation is a sincerely held religious belief. And boy, oh boy, does this run the gamut. How far can you go? Depends on how far you want to push the envelope. Depends on if you want to be kind of a test case and be stricter about this or not. I generally caution companies, you do not want to be a test case for litigation. And so you might want to be a little more flexible in this regard. Does that mean you're going to have, potentially more requests? It does. And so it's kind of a cost benefit analysis. We've gotten our slides here, a few different examples of requests about religious accommodation. I won't walk through each of them. They're here for you to take a look at, just some various options about how you can phrase things, what you can ask. Again, some say, just attest to it, maybe we'll follow up. Some say we need you to provide more. Some say we want a letter. So those are just some suggested approaches of what people have done that you may want to consider for your own company. And conversely, if you're an employee, what you can be expected to have to provide by your company as well. For accommodation generally, do you have to provide the accommodation requested? Not necessarily, not if it's not reasonable, not if it poses a direct threat to health and safety of others. For example, what if you have an employee that says, I cannot be vaccinated. My doctor has supported I cannot be vaccinated. I also can't wear a mask. I should be allowed to come into the workplace unmasked. I work in close proximity to others and I can't be tested and can't wear a mask and can't be vaccinated. All of those things are potentially going to pose a direct threat to the health and safety of others. So maybe that's something you don't accommodate and you need to look at alternatives. Again, this is for the interactive process. If something is going to put an undue hardship on the company, you do not have to accommodate if it's an undue hardship. That's a high test to meet. And so use that with caution. If you're going to go down that route, you really should connect with your counsel on this because this is, again, a big opportunity for employees to file a claim, and you want to make sure you are on solid ground if you are claiming an undue hardship. You can require people to get work in person, because they can wear masks, they can social distance. There are different things, people just don't get a blanket. I don't have to work ever. That's not what accommodation is. You can, for example, require remote work. Of course, what you can't do is retaliate, you can't discriminate, and you can't treat anyone differently if they seek an accommodation, even if it's an accommodation you don't grant. ultimately, this is why we like things kept with HR and not with your managers. So that way you've got, HR handling this, and there is less chance for even, implicit retaliation or discrimination or treating others differently. Quick question I wanted to answer about, hey, what if someone requests a religious accommodation and it contradicts other vaccines they have, or you think they generally don't have a sincerely held religious belief? This is, again, how far do you want to push this? Do you want to ask for a letter from, someone in their religion supporting their claim, which, you can do so. I don't think that you can just say, hey, we don't believe you, we aren't going to accommodate. I don't think that's good enough. I think that's too big of a risk, and you're really going to have a problem with that employee. And so, frankly, I think you're safer to err on the side of accommodating. And again, that can be, it can be remote work, it can be not remote work, and can be fine. You're coming to the office and you're going to be wearing a mask, and we're going to try to keep you more socially distanced. How to verify vaccine status. I said I'd get to this, and here we are. In Washington, what can you do? Here is what we can do, which is you can get your vaccine card, a photo of the card, or other documentation from a healthcare provider. We have the state immunization system, which, I most often deal with for kids in school, but this certainly can apply in this case as well, to have your immunization record updated and provide that. Washington does allow self-attestation. You do not have to allow self-attestation. Some people don't feel like it's good enough or it's not secure enough, and you don't have to allow it. Others say, hey, this is a good middle ground. I don't want to be too much big brother. I'm going to let my employees say whether they have been vaccinated or not. Risks on both sides, of course. There's, no guarantee someone is not lying. But it's, up to you and your workforce how you want to handle that and how you want to handle the attestation. But regardless, what you do need to do, especially if you are, in one of those required mandate groups, but even if you're in a group that wants to mandate for your workforce, you do need to show your process of verification and be ready to prove that you've done it and document it. And remember, this came into play even more when we had, looser masking requirements. That'll come back again. So just make sure you are keeping your process clear and can prove what you have done. This is kind of hey, how do we deal with a workforce that either maybe we don't want to require mandates, we don't have to, or where, we do want to require mandates, we're going to do it down the road. How do we prep for this? Two things I think are really helpful, and a number of employers have done these with some good success, not, always 100% success, but good success. And that's education and incentives. And so for education, you really want to work with employees. I think a lot of people say, let's take a team approach. Let's say, why are people not wanting to get vaccinated? What can we do? Why are they resistant? How can we help with that? How can we break down those barriers? How can we educate people? How can we make this doable for them? How can we encourage them to do it? Time off, of course. We have incentives here. Some people offer various monetary benefits. Hey, show me your vaccine card, you get $100. Show me your vaccine card, you get, this, nominal reward. I think people say you get water bottles, company swag, things like that. It does need to be minimal. So it cannot be you're going to get $1,000. I think that's too much. There's no, to my knowledge, I haven't seen a bright line rule yet on what a monetary incentive is okay. Generally, $100 or less is what I see commonly to incentivize people. You might also consider doing, kind of a survey in advance. Now, how much of your workforce are you dealing with that isn't vaccinated or that doesn't want to be vaccinated? And then focus on, okay, what incentives would help for that? Or they're just a handful of people that one-on-one conversations or, smaller education might be helpful. So those are some options as you think about going forward. I've said this, and I'm going to probably say it more times, but, this isn't a static one size fits all. It really does need to be tailored to your workforce and what you're dealing with. with employees. In a warehouse setting, that is different sometimes than an office setting. And understanding people's reasoning and education and incentivizing, those things could be very different. One question about, I'm just going to leap back to on collecting vaccination information. How do you keep and store those records? You do need to keep and store the records about who's vaccinated and who's not. That needs to be kept securely. And when you are asking for that information about vaccinated status, you cannot and should not be getting additional employee medical information. I encourage you to affirmatively tell employees, I don't want your medical information, the yes or the no, proof of vaccination. Keep it limited, especially when you're having, for example, managers look at this, not just HR. You do not want employees accidentally disclosing or you accidentally learning about potential medical information that you should not be finding out about. So be sure to beware about that. Question of risks of retaining vaccinated information. Frankly, if you're in one of these bigger groups, you're going to have to. And again, if we go back to, if you have a mask-free workforce at some point when, people can do that, and have to prove why you can have a mask free, it's because everyone's been vaccinated. You need to have those records. So you do need to keep it securely. Okay, returning to work. What do I do? How do we handle this? Are we there yet? Most people are not there yet. Many big and small companies are pushing this off. Some are starting. It's not too early to start thinking about it, even if it's too early for your company to be implementing it. So what you need to be looking at, of course, is the business need. That's something each individual business has to decide on its own. Again, understanding employees' concerns in their environment. Do they want to come back? Gosh, many, many people do not. And how are you going to deal with that? What are their concerns? How can you handle those concerns? Starting the conversation early. It's no accident the word communicate is on this slide 3 times. Because you want to start having these conversations. Let people know we are going to be returning to work at some point. Here, let's address your concerns. What are your concerns? Are you worried about safety? How do we be safe in this regard? And how do we keep you safe if you're using public transportation? How are you safe in our workspaces? Is it, are you in an office where you can close doors? That's safer, of course, but are you not? Are there public spaces? How are we handling this? Of course, we've got the cleaning, you've still got masking requirements, things like that, but addressing your employees' concerns. You want to remove barriers to them returning to work if that's where your company is headed. You have to, of course, address if they don't want to be vaccinated, or if they are vaccinated and are worried their coworkers are not vaccinated. So taking into account all of these types of things and what you want to do about them. And again, having those conversations. I think this is a big one. We are seeing this come up a lot. Employees believe that they have been working remotely successfully. And because they have been able to do that, why can't they do it forever? That might not be what your business wants to do. What is lost when you have remote work? Gosh, you lose a lot of training, a lot of one-off interaction, a lot of camaraderie, a lot of culture in your firm, in your company, whatever it may be. Different for every company, of course, but there are things lost. And if those things are important and they're part of the reason you want to return to work, then you want to be sharing and explaining that to your workers. And you want to talk about why it is important to have them in the office. For some things you just, need, in-office presentations, or you need to meet with clients or things that no longer can be done remotely. So address those. Others, it's just, collaboration, teamwork. Yes, you can be on your Zoom and share screen. Sometimes it's just not a substitute for the dynamic back and forth that you have when you're all in the same room. But be ready to answer those questions and talk through those things. And this is kind of, going back to even the vaccine, but now even, if it's not vaccine related, but just straight returning to work, what if you've got your great employees that don't want to return to work? Would you rather lose them, or would you rather compromise and see what you can do about having them come back to work? You are allowed to require them to return to the office, unless there's some sort of accommodation. That applies here. And of course, you need to work through that, just like we talked about in the medical and religious settings. And if they're high risk workers, need to work through that as well. And again, I'm not going to go through this because we talked about undue hardship, but if you are going to say it's an undue hardship and you need them in the office, be prepared to really justify that. And again, talk through that with your counsel, because it is a little bit of a stickier spot and a really big one where employees can go in and make claims about. But otherwise, you need to be communicating that even though they have worked at home in the past, you can require them to return, and you want to talk through the reasons for that, of course. I think I mentioned, practically speaking, do you want to survey your employees? These can be anonymous surveys about return to work and what they want and what they're hoping to get out of this return to work. Of course, do they want at least part-time working from home? Does that work for your company? Can you do that? Can you have a flexible approach? Can you phase it? Hey, we're going to start with 2 days back a week. We're going to see how that goes. We're going to build up to 3 days. Ultimately, we're going to go full-time. That could be in 3 months. It could be in 6 months. It could be in a year, could be to be determined. But just be considering these options. So that way, even if you reject them, I think it's really helpful to tell your employees what you've done and why. So keep that in your kind of back pocket of what you're doing. Okay, remote work. What if you're still working remotely? What can you do? How does this work? Yes, of course, you can still work remotely. We've had more and more employees moving to other states, vacationing extended in other states, where they're not on vacation, but working. They say it's temporary and there for a long time. So keep in mind that there could be tax implications for this, legal implications. Generally, employees are entitled to the benefits of the state where they're working and the laws where they're working, especially where those are the most beneficial to them. So keep that in mind. Of course, you've got ergonomic considerations. Hopefully, most people are past these initial hurdles of providing appropriate company property, making sure people are safe in their work environments. Privacy, confidentiality, security, those things, are still concerns. And I'm a little worried. I've heard, some companies thought, hey, this is a quick fix, send people home. I mean, remember when everyone thought it was only going to be 2 weeks? 18 months later, we're still here. So just make sure that you are not forgetting about these things, especially if you're looking at extended or permanent remote work. You've really got to beef up security, even see if you've got insurance to cover things. So keep that in mind, of course, as well. Wage and hour laws, if you've got people working overtime, or I should say outside of work hours too, you've got to have them keeping track of their hours, because you as a company are required to pay for all time worked. If you are an employee, you need to be hearing my words loud and clear. Track that time and make sure you're telling your employee about it. A lot of companies say you need to get pre-approval. Definitely do so if that's your company policy. Even if there is no pre-approval, that overtime must be paid if you are non-exempt. One way around this is for workers that don't need email access or all different kinds of work systems access. Limit that. Don't have them have that access. Or maybe you can limit the times that they're allowed to go on, or track the times they're allowed to go on. So just beware, this hasn't gone away. We're still seeing this. And companies, you should be tipped off when you're getting after hours emails or responses from your workers that this is happening, that they are potentially working outside of regular work hours and more than work hours. It's okay if they have flex hours and are working later, but you just need to understand that in advance, because you can certainly get into trouble if you aren't paying for that overtime. Remote work, discrimination, retaliation, we have up here, hey, does everyone have equal access? You don't want any harassment or anything that could be happening in the workplace to be happening remotely, of course. Want to make sure people are treated better. Actually, I was hearing recently, there's kind of a flip side to this, which has been a positive flip side that I hope people think about as they return to work, which is that some people, people of color in particular, that they felt like they weren't being treated as equally in the workplace, it's actually gotten better in the remote environment because, they aren't seeing people face to face. Everyone has more of a level playing field. Gosh, it's terrible to think those things are happening, that it wasn't a level playing field for them, for these, anyone that in the live work setting. But if that was the case, and if it's better remote, let's bring those things back once you're coming back to work. Let's make sure there are no discrimination, no retaliation, no harassment, none of that happening remotely. And to the extent things have improved, why have they improved? Let's bring that back. Let's improve our workforces as we go forward as well. I talked about, a little bit about these practical concerns. Hey, we don't want to lose our company culture. These are reasons why you want people to come back. Burnout is a big one. I think people can, that laptop's just always there. They can really just be attached and it's hard to shut it off. And that applies for exempt and non-exempt employees. And, also you want to make sure about equalizing workload. Are people that are, your essential workers in the office, are they taking on too much? Do you need to figure out how to equalize that again? This is a place, you want to be flexible. You did one thing when work went remote. You did one thing when it seemed like it was going to last and everyone thought maybe you'd be coming back by spring, by summer, by fall, but it just keeps happening. So it's okay to be flexible and revise how things are going in the workplace. Hiring and terminating during COVID. I'm just going to back up. I saw a quick question I wanted to answer about, hey, office supply expenses that employees pay for or companies pay for when people are working remotely. In general, I think it's best to have your company pay for the stuff. If you're paying for the stuff at work, the stuff being your pens, your papers, your, binders, whatever that stuff, provide those things to the extent you can do so. I think that's great. Do you necessarily have to be paying for an upgraded internet speed? No, you don't. Especially if you have an option of people working in the office and they're choosing to work remote, that analysis might be different. And again, this might be changed if an employee is choosing to work remotely permanently at their election, not the company's requirement. So this is a place you want to be flexible. When in doubt, and you can provide office supplies, equipment, do so, or reimburse as necessary. Although, whether it's required is really a different question. And usually not everything's going to be required, but I think requirements and good practice can be different. Okay, hiring and terminating during COVID. Hiring, yes, you can have people hired and say, you must be vaccinated. You can post that as a requirement and ask about vaccine status. Do I want you to ask them that, in your initial round of interview? Maybe not necessarily. I think following, posting like you do with criminal background stuff, vaccines are required, get through the process. And then you're going to want to ask about, are you vaccinated or otherwise? And I should have, sorry, I'm interrupting myself, but I really do want to clarify that there. Vaccine required, that needs an asterisk because it's also unless there is an approved accommodation. So it's vaccine required unless there's an approved accommodation, of course, because what we don't want to be doing is having people come in and say, oh, you have to be vaccinated and we aren't going to accommodate you, because that would not be legal. So absolutely make sure you're doing those accommodations. Then, as you've asked about the vaccine status in the process, someone could say, no, you have a medical reason. Great. Then at that point, you are going to have to deal with the interactive process. It happens even at hiring, not just for existing employees. Treading lightly with follow-up questions. This is where, I touch base on, we don't want to get too much medical stuff. We want to not get the medical, in fact. And if you do, you want to keep it confidential. You don't want to have, for example, various managers or colleagues in an interview finding out about an employee's medical issues. That is not okay. You want this directed with HR. You want this to be kept, confidential and have HR handle the accommodation. Best time to be asking about vaccination status is there's no, I think, specific, this is your moment. I think it's best if you've gone through kind of the determine the person has met the requirements for the job in general, and then your next step, whether that's, at the interview process or, about to give a conditional offer of employment there, not at the upon application process. Lost my screen there. Okay. For hiring, you want to be aware of telling people the expectations. If you currently have a remote job and that is going to change and you're going to have them coming back to work, tell people in advance so they know if they want that job that's going to require in-office work or not. Onboarding, integrating people, it's just plain tough when you've got remote workers. So keep that really in mind. You have to go the extra mile, give it the extra effort. You'll probably want to do early reviews, make sure things are working out, address things that aren't, and handle them early on. What if things are not working out and you need to terminate? Yes, you can terminate people during COVID. And this here, I'm talking about terminations for things other than, for example, not meeting your mandatory vaccine policy. But let's say they're just, work isn't going well, not doing a great job, hired someone, it's just really terrible. Hey, you've got to be able to terminate, but you want to make sure you've documented this. Focus on the objective reasons why. I really don't like it when I'm hearing, it wasn't a good fit, didn't work out, especially when someone's only ever been remote and they barely had any interaction. Focus on those objective business reasons, and really be, handling those issues then. And if you are in a certain circumstance, I always say consider a severance and release agreement that can protect the company from claims. Not appropriate in every circumstance, but a good idea if you're wondering if it is, connect with your counsel about that one. I'm just going to leap back to one question I saw here, which was, hey, is recruiting team best equipped to ask about candidate vaccine status or handled by HR? This should be an HR process. This really shouldn't be a recruiting getting into that. You can let them know there's this position requires a vaccine or an approved accommodation, but otherwise the details of that better handled by HR. All right, just a couple more slides on this. I'm sorry, we might be ending with the worst ones. Litigation. What does this mean? What's happening? Oh, geez, it is happening and increasing. I think the last statistic I saw was from a few days ago, maybe a week ago. It was certainly over 3,600 by then, but at a minimum, it's at least 3,500 or more COVID-related lawsuits in the US between March 2020 and earlier in September of this year. And a big increase happened in the summer of 2021. Summer is often a little bit slower for litigation or lawsuits to be filed, not this year and not for COVID. And guess what the majority of the cases are about? Remote work, accommodation, discrimination, retaliation, all those things we just talked about. And you know who those targets are? They tend to be the smaller employers, the smaller companies with 50 or fewer employees. And it's hard to say, is it because smaller companies just aren't up on, the accommodation process or how to handle that? Who knows? I can say these are not class actions for the most part. They're mostly individual lawsuits. A lot of them are being resolved in court, not being settled. But the point is, this is an area that is probably going to increase. Some of them are about mandatory vaccines, but really, I think the ones that you'll probably face the most are the individual claims about, I want to work from home, you haven't accommodated me, I don't feel like I'm being treated correctly, those types of things. I said this already, worth repeating, you just don't want to be a test case. So when in doubt, you might want to consider erring on the side of being more generous or accommodating to your employees. What if you really don't want to have litigation? You're scared about mandatory vaccine policies and you aren't required, like you aren't a larger employer. You can allow alternate weekly testing. You can even allow that if you are the larger employer. So consider that as an option. Everything's got a risk associated with it. Of course, we don't know yet enough about the costs and those types of things, but it's something to consider. And I talked before about this, so this is just a repeat, but you really want to make sure your HR and managers are trained about how to handle vaccination status, medical accommodation, religious accommodation, having HR people handle it so you don't have a risk of your managers, unintentionally dealing with retaliating or not promoting because, hey, they believe in vaccinations and this worker isn't vaccinated, or vice versa. You just don't want that to happen. So really keep it to HR. Kind of parting word on this is consistency, really treating everyone in the same situation the same way. So just because, you like someone better, don't treat them differently if they're not vaccinated than their other buddy you don't like so well who's not vaccinated. Really treat everyone the same. That'll help you in a defense to the extent you need it in litigation. And of course, getting your similar treatment aligned with these laws and aligned with how we've talked about today for accommodations and training and those types of things will help as well. So that's it. I know that was a long one, but hopefully we've answered some questions for you. We've gotten so many of these questions in this vein for the past year and wanted to make sure we're getting you all the latest information and what you can and can't do.